So the traditional way that we would use this package that we've installed is to take the name key, the value key, the name and the value and pass it through to a view, or render the HTML here or whatever we're doing. Now we're not doing that. We have a slightly more advanced setup. And also this method takes a lot more code, a lot more duplication, and we really want to try and avoid that. So we're not going to be doing that. Instead, we'll create some middleware to set this all up for us. So let's head over to our middleware section, and we can call this something like cross-site request forgery view middleware. So CSRF view middleware. So again, we can just copy it over from here and just change the names up just to make this a little bit simpler. So cross-site request forgery view middleware, we can get rid of this because we don't need it, and we can go ahead and add this middleware to our app. So let's go down and we're done. So let's just refresh to make sure we didn't break anything, and it looks good. So what do we want to do in here? Well, again, we want to share with our view a name and a value, but what we also want to do more conveniently is share a pre-built field that we can use. So if we just head over to our sign up form, the way that this would look is down here, we would have a hidden input. Now the name would be cross-site request forgery name. That's the method we used earlier. And this would have a value. What we would also have is a cross-site request forgery token. And then this would have in here the actual value. So we don't want to have to keep writing this out every single time. So we're going to build this up so we can eventually do something like this: cross-site request forgery raw, or cross-site request forgery field raw, whatever we want to do. So let's do this now. Over in our middleware, what do we need to do? Well, we need to say this container view get environment add global, and in here we want an array. So we're going to call this cross-site request forgery, and we're going to pass an array in. Now you can pass the name and the value and both tokens if you want to, but I'm just going to send through a field here. Just makes sense. And this is just going to be a string. So I'm going to pull this down. This gets a little bit messy, but it doesn't matter too much. So in here, we're going to create our two inputs. These are hidden inputs. We have a name for these inputs, and we have a value for these inputs. So let's duplicate this down. So the first one, we need to use the get token key or get token name key method that we saw earlier. So all we're going to do is just append this onto here. And we get this from our container. So remember, we have our container on our base middleware. We have the cross-site request forgery package attached to our container. So we can now use get token name key. And if you're wondering about this cross-site request forgery package, remember it's called guard. You can go over to cross-site request forgery source guard, and you can see these methods. So get token name, get token value, get token name key, and value key. These are just convenient methods so we can pull them out of here. So now that we've got this, we now need the actual value for the name. So remember, this is either cross-site request forgery name or cross-site request forgery token. So here, all we do is say this container cross-site request forgery get token name. And we're going to do the same for the value as well. So again, we just pull this in, this container cross-site request forgery, and this one is get token value key, and obviously we need the value, so it's this container again cross-site request forgery, and it's get token value. So now that we have this passed through to our views, what we can now do is use cross-site request forgery dot field within our form, and we'll see both them inputs. And that means that whichever form that we create, because remember, all of our post routes are now protected, so we can't submit them unless we have these values in here. So this is really handy because now we can just say cross-site request forgery field, and we need raw because otherwise we will actually see this markup. So we can test this out. So there you can see we've got an input type of hidden cross-site request forgery name, and this is the name of the like key essentially, if you want to call it that. And then we have the actual value, which is the hash, and submitting these through the form will then work. So all we need to do is use the raw filter within Twig. When we refresh, they are now part of our input, so we can just make sure that they are in there. You can see that they're in there now. And now when we submit our form, it works. Obviously our validation rules have come through, but we now have cross-site request forgery set up and ready to go. So whenever we create a new form, we don't have to do anything else. All we need to do is use this just here, and everything will be nice and protected against cross-site request forgery attacks.